Okay, number 4, it's a word problem, and probably the biggest difficulty with word problems is just setting it up. So it says, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the Cambria Incline was the steepest railway in the world when it was made in 1893. It rises 514 feet vertically and moves 734 feet horizontally. Find the length of the track. So if I were to draw a picture of this information, what you'll find out is that you have a right triangle, and the vertical part, they said, was 514, and the horizontal part was 734, and they're trying to find the hypotenuse. And so this is not necessarily the distance formula, this is kind of like the after effects, which is the Pythagorean theorem. So we just go with x squared equals 514 squared plus 734 squared. And of course, if we don't want that square on the x, because it's the Pythagorean theorem, we would square root both sides. And so your x is equal to whatever the square root of 514 squared plus 734 squared, which when I calculate it, and you can check on your calculators, I get 896.08 feet. So somebody check that out, see if you get the same. In number 5, a straight up midpoint problem. So if we're trying to find the midpoint, remember we have two parts here. We have the first point, x1, y1, the second point, x2, y2. And if we use the distance formula, if you remember, the distance was going to be equal to, add up the two x's, -3 plus 1, chop it in half, and then add up the two y's, 14 and 10, chop that in half, and simplify. So -3 plus 1 is -2. -2 divided by 2 is -1. 14 and 10 added together is 24. 24 divided by 2 is 12. And voila, there's your midpoint. If you're looking for where those things came from, remember that the 1 and the 10 were your x2, y2, and that the -3 and the 14 were your x1, y1. In number 6, a picture might be useful, but it's not necessary actually. In this particular problem, if I were to draw a circle, what they're talking about is that in this circle, you have one point being -1, 5, so maybe it's over here somewhere, -1, 5, and another one being 4, -3, so it's maybe down here somewhere. And if you were to connect those two things, that's the diameter that's going through the circle. And they want to know, what are the coordinates of the midpoint? So the midpoint would be here. That's also called the center, because the center is halfway between the 2 points on the circle that comprise the diameter. So really you're finding the midpoint. So the center, which is also the midpoint of the diameter, would be the same thing as -1 plus 4, chop it in half, and 5 plus -3, chop it in half. So -1 and 4 is 3, divided by 2 is 1.5. And 5 and -3 is +2 divided by 2, which is +1. So 1.5 comma 1 are the coordinates of the center, which in this case would also be the midpoint of the diameter. Then our midpoints from the past, in number 7, they tell us what the midpoint is of a segment, and then they want us to find another coordinate. What that means is, I'm looking at some segment, and there are 3 pieces. One is the midpoint, which they tell us is 2, 5. 1 is an endpoint, which is -3, -4, and 1 is the other point, which we don't know. I'm going to call it x and y. Now let's say that I was talking about the orange midpoint. And the middle of this segment is the average of the two ends. What that means is that if I look at the x parts, I know that -3 plus x divided by 2 should give me 2. So this 2 right here, the x part of my midpoint, is this 2 that I'm talking about. And that happens if I average the two x values. So the x plus the x, chop it in half, gives me 2. If I solve that red equation, I can find out what my x is. So I move on and I solve that equation. If I multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of the 2 division on the bottom, so if I multiply, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? If I multiply the left side by 2 and the right side by 2, the 2's on the left cancel out and I get -3 plus x is 4. And then if I solve for x, that means I would be adding 3 to both sides, which means that x is 7. So here's one part of my solution. X is 7. And you can always check your work. So let's say I look at that 7, which is the 7 that goes right there. That means that 7 plus -3 divided by 2 should be 2. So 7 plus -3 is 4. Chop it in half and you get 2. So you can always check your work. If I look at the y part of your coordinates, then that means, as I'm looking at the y part, that the -4 that I see in the light blue plus the y value, which I don't know, if I average those two, I'm supposed to get 5. So this 5 that I'm talking about is the 5 that came from our orange midpoint. And I'm looking at the two y values from the ends and averaging them. Just like in the x one, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of the division by 2. That's not a square, that's times 2. So the 2's on the right-hand side cancel out, and I get -4 plus the y value equals 10. And then to solve that, of course, I would add 4 to both sides, and that gives me y equals 14. And I can also check that 14, because that means that 14 plus -4 divided by 2 is 5. So 14 plus -4 is 10. Divide that by 2, and I get my 5. In number 8, is it says to find the perimeter. So the word perimeter, when you're looking at it, in this particular case right here, is talking about the different distances all the way around. So it's talking about this distance right here, this distance right here, this distance right here, and this distance right here. What this means to you, in order to solve this problem, which I'm not going to do for you, but you can try on your own as an extra practice problem, is it means you're going to use the distance formula four times, and after you use the distance formula 4 times, you're going to add all of the distances. When you do that, you will find the perimeter.